Hi, everyone. This is Beenish Ahmed. I'm the founder of the Alignist, and I'm really excited to share our broadcast of our fourth featured novelist, Helon Habila, and he will be joined by Omolade Adunbi. Helon Habila, as you know, if you read Oil on Water, is the author of this book. He's also a professor of creative writing at George Mason University, and he's written two other novels as well as a work of nonfiction about the girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram in Chibok from their school. We're also joined, as I said, by Omolade Adunbi. He's a political anthropologist, and he's a professor in the Department of Afro-American and American Studies at the University of Michigan, which happens to be my alma mater. His latest book is called Oil, Wealth, and Insurgency in Nigeria, and it deals with a lot of the issues that are raised in Oil on Water. So this should be a really rich conversation based on some of the issues that come from oil extraction in one of the world's leading oil producers. So we'll start with you, Helon. This novel touches on so many people who are impacted by oil extraction, from a character who is a small-time oil thief using jerry cans to whole communities that are sort of drenched in the aftermath of oil extraction in the Niger Delta. What made you want to write a novel about this particular issue?
Well, as a Nigerian, I, of course, was following the politics, of that time. The novel is set in the around 2007, 2006, 2008. This was when this issue was very topical. This was when you had all the kidnappings in the Niger Delta. And I was living outside my country at the time. And I was reading about this in the news all the time. So it was kind of unsettling for me, upsetting. And one wants to contribute as much as possible to the national discourse, to try to say one's piece. And as a writer, the only way to do it is through writing. So I thought I should write about it. And at the same time, I was contacted by a film company to write a film script for them because they wanted to write a movie about the whole Niger Delta uprisings and things like that. So kind of the two things came together. And I wrote the movie script for them. And afterwards, I turned the script into a novel. And it was published around 2010, yeah.
Sorry, I just muted myself, but so it started as a film script. That's interesting.
Yeah, this is a film company from England, yeah.
Well, and I wonder about if you said you weren't living in your country at the time. How did being outside of your context motivate you? Did you feel like these were issues that perhaps weren't getting addressed on the international stage, given that we all are very big users of oil and beneficiaries of some of what's produced, but don't often see the impact of it on a local level?
Well, actually, there was an overexposure of that topic in the national media. If you remember at that time, CNN even sent people to Nigeria to go and interview some of the rebels. And every day you would see reference to it in the media. I mean, this was about foreigners being kidnapped in Nigeria, Westerners who were, working in the oil industry. So it was quite topical. My worry at that time was that there was a lack of depth, lack of nuance to all the coverage. And I think a novel does nuance better than just this kind of topical newspaper coverage. So one of the intentions for me was to try to go behind the headlines, to try to show these people and the complexity of the whole situation. It's not just about Nigerians kidnapping foreigners. There is something kind of deeper than that. There's a history behind it. So I hope that my novel was able to do that, to show the complexity and the nuance, and to, in a way, to go back to the cliche, to humanize these people, even though they're already human. But you want to show the complexity, really, and to give a brief history also of what Nigeria was about and how we came to the point where the story kind of takes off.
Well, and maybe I can put that question to Omolade for people who aren't so familiar with how this came to be. How did this become such a tool of people who were in the Niger Delta and impacted by oil extraction to kidnap foreigners? Was this something that was pretty novel on the world stage?
Thank you very much for that very good question.
Yes.
Just like Helon mentioned earlier on, no one was paying attention to the insurgency going on in the Niger Delta until the insurgents started kidnapping foreign oil workers in the area. And that was one of the strategies that they used in attracting attention to the plight of the Niger Delta people. And they took a cue from what was going on in Iraq in 2003, when a lot of insurgents in Iraq started kidnapping foreigners. But in the case of the Niger Delta, they did it in a completely different way. They said they were not interested in killing foreigners, but that they realized when the Iraqi insurgents started kidnapping, a lot of international attention shifted to that. So by doing that in the Niger Delta, it became a way for them to attract international attention to the plight of the Niger Delta so that people will appreciate what they are fighting for. And of course, that is not, that is not far-fetched when you look at the materiality of oil itself. So for those of us who live in the United States and other Western world, oil is so invisible to us, and the violence that oil generates or the conflict it generates around the world is so invisible to us, because even when we go to the gas station to pump gas, you don't see what you are pumping, but you know that you filled your gas, your tank, and your car is ready to go. But where that comes from, you are not aware of, you are oblivious of that. But by using kidnapping of foreign workers, so they were able to call attention to, hey, this oil actually comes from some areas that are inflicted with a lot of environmental devastation. And I think that is exactly what Helon's book is also trying to call attention to, that look, these guys, they are not criminals. They also need to be humanized in a way that will bring attention to the plight of the Niger Delta people. That these are people who have lost their livelihood. These are people whose environment have been destroyed by the activities of a lot of multinational corporations.
We can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
I'm coming. So sorry. Because I noticed I'm like fidgeting and knocking things, and then it keeps, the camera goes to me. So I thought I'd mute, but I'm not so clever to come back and unmute. Sorry. But I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about some of those individual figures and how they sort of shifted. We have, of course, the figure of Ken, I'm blanking on his name right now, but I'm sure Ken Saro-Wiwa, and his kind of really the movement that he led, and kind of how the movement shifted and perhaps really became more militant, more taking more deadly tactics. And how did this sort of shift? Did it start to perhaps, did the motivations shift over time as perhaps the tactics were that maybe initially pretty peaceful tactics really dramatically shifted? So I guess, could you just tell us a little bit about what prompted that? And was it the actors changing? Were the circumstances changing? Why did we see this kind of dramatic shift on the main kind of players in this resistance?
Well, yeah, it has a long history. So I think the first oil well in Nigeria in our library was dug in 1968. So this was just I think after independence. Nigeria got independence in 1960. So we had the first oil well, in the 60s. And then, before then, you had this beautiful land. This is the largest delta, I think, in the whole world. It was called the lungs of Africa because of the beauty and the diversity of animal life and things like that. And this then, in front of our eyes, in one generation, it began to be systematically destroyed by the oil companies. And as you mentioned, Kensara Wiwa from the Ogoni tribe, in Niger Delta, decided to challenge the government and to bring the attention of the whole world to what was happening. Government, of course, was not paying attention. Government was busy collecting rent from the oil companies. Because when you look at Nigeria was the 7th largest oil producer in the whole world. So we're talking about a lot of oil being dug from the Niger Delta. And the people of the place felt that they were not getting the benefits of what was taken from their land. Instead, the environment was being destroyed. I went there when I was researching for the book, and I had been there even before then. You could see the effect of the oil extraction there. The rivers are basically covered in oil. You find the children bathing in oil, and of course the fishes and everything being destroyed. So people like Kensara decided to stage a non-violent resistance or kind of demonstration against what was going on, against the oil companies. And Kensara likened what was happening to genocide. And that was when he began to get the world's attention, that essentially what the government and the oil companies were trying to do was to destroy the whole people of Niger Delta because they were taking the means of livelihood away from them. These were farmers and hunters, and everything was being destroyed and they were not getting anything in return. So that was the origin. Then what happened, Kensara was hanged by the Abacha government in, I think, 1994, 95. So that was an escalation of the whole thing that was started by the government of Nigeria. And I think things kind of started to deteriorate from there. The people became kind of more militant, more aggressive. And then you had all the young people who were coming up. They were a bit less patient than people like Kensara Wiwa. And they decided to take things into their hands and to draw the world's attention. And I think that was the genesis of all the kidnappings and the violence. But essentially, I think the government of Nigeria was neglecting its duty to its citizens. And the citizens were left with nothing but to kind of escalate in order to draw the attention of both the government and, of course, the world itself. And I tried to show all that in the novel by describing the landscape and, of course, by the very act of the kidnapping and the highly militarized nature of the whole confrontation.
Yeah, and I think that, so many sides of this are presented so well in your novel, from sort of the indigenous groups that are just trying to manage their own land and live as well as they can off of what has been a totally kind of devastated region situation. And then the militants who are a little bit more complicated. You don't quite know if their motives are purely for money, if they're actually from there, what kind of, or if they're just trying to get a stake in some of the wealth. And not to say that that's necessarily nefarious if your country is producing massive amounts of money, and even some in the country are clearly profiting, and the people who are most impacted might not be. And I don't mean to kind of imply anything about their intentions, but I just think that those characters are quite complex, and so I think you kind of present those different aspects really well, and that's what was so kind of engaging about the novel. And then, of course, the journalist who's trying to make sense of it and decide, who to believe, who to trust, which is so much the work of journalists. But Omolade, I wonder if you could just bring us up to speed on some of these issues. Where does this stand now? Is this resistance still pretty active, or has it kind of become just par for the course, where this is how things are and there isn't as much of an effort to try to shift the status quo in this way?
Yeah, I think the status quo still remains the same. Although when the government of the current administration, General Buhari, came to power in 2015, they tried to introduce some palliative measures by saying they were going to do the cleanup of Ogoni land that Kensarua campaigned for. And they actually started the cleanup. But of course, as the United Nations Environment Program report indicated, it's going to take close to 30 years and up to $30 billion to clean up Ogoni land. And that is just one section of the entire Niger Delta. So, which means if Ogoni land is going to take up to $30 billion to clean up, you can imagine how much it's going to take to clean up the entire Niger Delta. And of course, it's not as if exploration or exploitation of oil has stopped. It has not. It's still continuing in the Delta. Then the second point is that what did the insurgency achieve? Well, when the insurgency started, a lot of Niger Delta people had, they thought that that was going to help in solving a lot of the existential problems that they had, like lack of healthcare facilities, lack of schools, lack of good roads, lack of potable water. So they thought that was going to help bring attention and probably let the government solve a lot of their problems. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And why is that so? It is because the government negotiated with the leaders of the insurgency in 2009, and a lot of the leaders basically got paid off. So they got paid off, and those who were not paid off, they were some of them were placed on monthly stipends by the government, and some of them were even being paid by far higher than the minimum wage for the country. But unfortunately for the state, by 2015, there was a recession and there was also a collapse in the price of oil in the international market. So when the agreement was negotiated with the insurgents, oil was selling for about $140 per barrel. Then by 2015, 2016, it collapsed and came down to about $27 per barrel. So the government couldn't sustain that. So then the insurgents regrouped, and they started making demands from the state again. But of course, the state had to renegotiate and continue to pay off the leaders. Then what is the outcome of this? It is that the foot soldiers were left behind in the whole process. So now there is another form of devastation that is taking place in the Delta, and that is the refining of oil by some of these former insurgents and some community members across the Niger Delta. So, and this is devastating to the environment and devastating to a lot of the livelihood of the people there. So it's like a double jeopardy for them. The state is not there to help. Then they say, oh, okay, we are going to take it upon ourselves to also help ourselves and generate our livelihood from what we own. But of course, that is also devastating to the environment and devastating to life itself.
Yeah, and kind of to jump in to, I also want to kind of point out that this is not a problem that's just unique to the Niger Delta. This is a national, kind of Nigeria-wide problem. You have the Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria. This is the same country we're talking about. So you have all these things taking place around the same time in the same country. And this should show you that it's a larger problem of democracy that we're having in Nigeria, poor governance and things like that. So the rulers are not really doing what they are supposed to do. The youth are not being taken care of. Basically, more education is needed, more opportunities for young people is needed. Otherwise, you have this teeming population of under 30s in Nigeria, which is about 80% of the population is supposed to be under 30. So, and there's no plan for them. And this problem is not going to be solved until the government decides to have like a comprehensive plan on what to do to address this problem of unemployment and insecurity and things like that.
Right, and I think that's and I'm curious to talk to you a little bit about what you learned from talking to those who had been, the worst impacted by the militancy of Boko Haram, the families of and some of the girls who were kidnapped from their school, and just kind of how it sits with you that leaders of the country have said that the fight with Boko Haram is over, that they're winning, or that they won, and this is kind of a constant refrain, even though, as early as I think earlier this year, there was another massive kidnapping. So is this the same kind, I guess, yeah, how do you make of the grand shift between, or the huge chasm, I guess, between what the government says and what it's doing and what the ground realities are that you yourself have seen, again, both in the Niger Delta and in the northern part of the country where Boko Haram is active?
Well, the fight against terror and terror itself is largely about perception. It's about who controls the narrative. So when the government says that it has won the war or is winning the war, they're trying to, in a way, reassure the people that they are winning, and maybe try to demoralize the terrorists that they are getting the upper hand. So it doesn't actually mean that they are winning. The war is still going on. How can you say you've won when there are girls still being kidnapped, when there are thousands and thousands of people still being held by Boko Haram and territory still being taken by Boko Haram?
Is there something that stuck out with you in what you were able to talk to some of those impacted by? Like, what, I guess, when you think of that situation, because, as you know, the way that these things get reported, it's like it's a massive headline, and then it sort of recedes from people's consciousness. And of course, that story and the movement to bring back our girls stuck around for a little bit, but since then there hasn't been much follow-up. So I guess, what have you heard from people on the ground about the situation and about how much it's impacted them, or just like one anecdote that kind of stayed with you from those you spoke to who had gone through this and kind of seen the media frenzy and then watched it fade?
It's a very complex situation. There's no simple way to explain it or to say this is it. Every day something changes. What the government, I think, should focus on is how they can partner with international organizations, because the nation itself, Nigeria, cannot win this war alone. They have to have a comprehensive plan, and they have to stick to it and try to get the help of people like, the US, not just militarily, but also in terms of education, health, and other things. But most importantly, the government needs to reevaluate the way it governs. You don't just govern by force like you try to do in the Niger Delta and try to suppress the people or suppress the population in northeastern Nigeria by trying to fight terrorism. You have to do more than that. And that is the whole challenge of democracy in Africa, not just in Nigeria, it's in Africa. How do you approach democracy? We're finding like a systematic failure of democracy. Democracy cannot work without education. Nigeria is a highly illiterate society. There are lack of opportunities for people to go to school. The schools are being underdeveloped every day. How do you address that? And unless we address that, democracy can never work, and you can never have peace. And that is what the leaders are avoiding. They're having palliatives, like you said. They're having short-term measures, short-term solutions, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, I think again that one of the ways in which the government will need to tackle the crisis in the northeast of Nigeria is to not see the war against Boko Haram as mainly a terrorist war and a war on terror. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, there is a lot going on in the region. There is a drug trade which is being organized by a lot of the Boko Haram insurgents. So, but for the government to just see it as, oh, these are Islamist group, will be missing the point about where the insurgents are getting the resources they are using to prosecute the war from. So the state will need to pay attention to that. Then the second point is that this is not just a war that Nigeria can win. So there is a porous border in the region, particularly the border between Nigeria and the Republic of Chad, Cameroon, Niger Republic, and a few other West African countries there. So there has to be a regional cooperation in tackling the crisis. So if there is no regional cooperation, then a lot of the insurgents can just be moving back and forth from a lot of these border towns and attacking civilians in the area. And I think when the current administration started in 2015, they tried to convene a regional summit to talk about what the solutions might be. But I think after a few maybe successful military activities against the insurgents, they thought they had won. Then they went to sleep. So, but that is not exactly the case. But then the final point I'll make about this is that the difference between the region and the Niger Delta are twofold. The first is that there is no resources that benefits the government from the region. So that is why they are not paying serious attention to it. So life has become banal in the area and it's dispensable. But unlike in the Niger Delta, where the heart of the Nigerian economy lies, so they can't take that place for granted, which is why they had to negotiate with the insurgents so that the revenue stream of the government will not stop. Then the final point is that the other thing that is responsible for the crisis in the northeast of Nigeria is climate change. So the Chad basin, which is Lake Chad, is drying up, and Lake Chad used to provide a lot of employment opportunities for fishermen and women and youth around the area. So now that Lake Chad is drying up, so the insurgents can easily entice a lot of people with small cash to join the insurgency. And then the other thing is that, a lot of those who are also running away from the insurgents are leaving the area to other cities in Nigeria, which is also a crisis in itself.
It's a really deep issue because, these are some of the things we've seen all over the world with, as you say, dealing with militants not purely as Islamist or religiously motivated militants, because as we know, the Taliban are some of the main kind of movers of drugs across the world. And we've seen similar kinds of things with ISIS and selling antiquities even for wealth to fund their, campaign of brutality. So these are multifaceted kind of groups and multifaceted issues. It's important to remember that and not paint them kind of in broad strokes. I wanted to ask you if there's anything you might want to add as we kind of wrap up here. But one thing that maybe just because it's a personal interest to me, that Helon, you mentioned at the top, that I thought maybe you could speak to before some kind of final remarks is, you mentioned how you see novels as a way to present a more nuanced picture, to kind of paint these multifaceted characters in a way that maybe, a short news story is not quite able to do. And I wonder about how, I read that you worked as a journalist for a time, and I'm interested in learning a little bit about how your reporting contributed to your, writing in a creative way, and vice versa, how you think those play out in your mind as you approach this work, because it seems like you do have a mission that's a similar mission to reporters, is to get the story out.
Yeah, I was a journalist in my former life. I did a bit of journalism in Nigeria before I moved from Nigeria, and so I kind of know the two worlds of the novel writing and being a journalist. I think the biggest challenge for me while writing the book was try to make it less political. I didn't want to sound as if I was writing a news headline, and I didn't want my reader to see it in that simplistic way that most world media would cover it. So I had to make it interesting. One, it's a story. My duty is to entertain the reader. There is that. And then, of course, there's the challenge of trying to pass a message as I entertain the reader. And so obviously what I did was to try to use, apart from using a journalist who is also a photographer, through whose eyes we would see the landscape that is devastated as they travel. It's a road novel. So they're traveling from Port Harcourt, where the assignment begins, and they move into the Delta, and as they travel, we see through their eyes the landscape that's destroyed. I don't have to tell the reader that, oil is destroying the landscape. You just see it. It's there. They're traveling on the river, which is layered with oil. And I use also a kind of detective fiction genre style, because there's a kidnapping. And usually in this kind of novels, when you have a kidnapping, you send a detective to go and try to determine if the kidnapped person is alive and also try to rescue them. So the detective in this case is my journalist, Rufus and Zach. And there's a reason why I chose them as journalists, because I see the role of the journalist as very, very important. I mean, you can't have a democracy without journalism, without vibrant journalism. So I'm addressing all these issues at the same time, kind of layering them without being too political, because it's already too political, So using the kind of thriller technique, I think, helped me to lull the reader into thinking that he's reading a detective story, but I'm trying to tell him also what's going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I think it was definitely something that was really clear from the very start, the landscape, the devastation that oil had wrought on it. Is there anything that you just want to add that you think readers should know, or maybe anything that you want to say that in closing, sort of about some of the issues that were raised here?
What can I say? The only thing is to, for the reader to enjoy the book.
Yeah.
And hopefully to understand that this is, I think, one of the most challenging issues of our time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just happening in the Niger Delta. I've traveled to other parts of the world and I've seen the same thing happening. From gas flaring to oil exploration and devastation of the environment. It is very real, it's very big. When you read books like Rob Nixon's, trying to remember the title, I'm sure Olade will know the title of Rob Nixon's book. But I've seen it in places like Curacao, where I went once to give a talk, and there's this Curacao used to be an oil refining community. They don't have oil, but they refine oil. And there was this lake that Shell had dumped, the oil, whatever, refined oil on it. And when the wind blew, it actually blew towards the school where we were talking, and people had to evacuate their houses and the classrooms just because of that toxic air that was blowing, from the lake. So it's not just in Nigeria; it's all over the world. And as we just heard from the United Nations warning that we have about 20 years or so before everything kind of goes to the dogs. So I think people should think about that. It's not just entertainment; it's also a very serious issue that's facing us every day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think also that by reading books like Helon's and others that have been written about not only the Niger Delta, but a lot of indigenous communities across the world where resources are in abundance, but they are also not benefiting from those resources. So it gives human face to many of these, and also makes a distinction between what is criminal and what is a struggle for human rights, human and environmental rights. In most cases, particularly in mainstream media, there is always the tendency to see every struggle as a criminal act. But what books like this does is to give a good narrative and nuances to such struggles of the indigenous people, whether it is in the Niger Delta or it is in the Ecuadorian Amazon, or wherever it might be.
Yeah, or even right here in the United States with
absolutely
the oil pipeline and in North Dakota. So these aren't issues that are too far from home necessarily. Well, thank you both for those insights. I really appreciate it. I think this has been a really rich discussion. Definitely could go on longer, but I think we have a lot to mull over and consider, and hopefully to think deeply about as we, move about our lives, and to, look for the other side of the story when we are flashing through headlines. So thank you both for taking the time to talk to me and to share some insights with our subscribers. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to me too, and thank you for highlighting these books and these issues.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thanks. Have a good night or a good day, man. Yeah. It's not been that long of a conversation. All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.